this multipolar world is coming. These countries are rising, their living standards are rising, hundreds of millions, actually billions of people are living better today in those countries than ever before. So this is a good thing. This is a very good thing that the world is not as unequal as it was in the past. So how do we in the Western countries that always benefited from the previous system, how do we deal with a new, more diverse world, with a more multipolar world? There's no easy answer to this, but this is why I'm suggesting that we do need to rethink the narratives around international relations, because they've all been written in Washington, in London and Brussels and other places, and Canberra, places in the West where we've had our particular view of the world.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Dr. David Morris. David is the CEO of the Australian-China Business Council in Tasmania and the director of several companies and NGOs promoting trade, investment, and intercultural understanding. He's also a senior research fellow with the Beijing Foreign Studies University, and previously he was working as a diplomat. Among other postings, he served in Beijing, representing the International Organization of Oceania. David recently published an interesting book with the title A New Era of Risk: Why We Need a New Sustainable Internationalism to Manage the Rise of China. This is what we want to discuss today. So, David, welcome.
Hello, Pascal. Great to be here.
Great having you, and your book that came out recently, as I understand, and it's kind of an evolution of your PhD dissertation, right?
Yes, indeed. I've just received the hard copy, actually. So there it is. So,
Wonderful.
yes, it's
Um,
based on the research that I did for my PhD dissertation, research across the Belt and Road, around the world, going to places in Central Asia and Southeast Asia. Of course, time spent in China as well, and more than 100 interviews with decision makers and leaders. And so hopefully it brings some fresh information.
Who was your main target with the research? Were you trying to research how the West approaches China's rise, or were you trying to approach how China manages its own rise and its perceptions by the West?
Well, this is a very good question, and it's the question everyone asks because we assume that each author comes to a topic with their own bias and wanting to present a particular view. And of course, I recognize that, of course, I come with my own biases as well, but I genuinely tried to understand a diversity of views. So, being a citizen of the Asia Pacific, I'm very much aware that Asia itself is such a diverse part of the world, and there are so many different perspectives. And so I wanted to bring, even though I was based in Europe for some of the time that I was writing this, I wanted to bring to Western audiences, but also to audiences elsewhere, a diversity of views. I wanted to try and understand, how does China see things? How do Western countries, how do other countries in the middle, neutral, non-aligned countries, how do they see their interactions with a rising China? So that's what I've tried to do in this book. Of course, I come from Australia. I no doubt came with some of my own biases, but it's a genuine attempt to understand complexity and diversity.
Yeah, and it shows in the book. I mean, you're not starting from a point where a lot of Western analysis begins with, which is China threat and managing China in the sense of how do we make sure that China remains as constrained as possible. You're actually starting with what is this Chinese approach that they're trying, and you also focus a lot on the Belt and Road Initiative. Can you give us maybe your analysis of how you view China's rise, maybe from more from a Chinese perspective or South or Pacific perspective than from the West?
Yeah, well, I think I could even start talking about it from an Australian perspective, if you like,
Mhm.
because I was a diplomat with the Australian government in the 1980s and 90s, when Australia was very enthusiastically engaging, not just with China, but of course with all of the key economies of East Asia in particular. And Australia was very busy building architecture, building regional cooperation. So building APEC, for example, which was an Australian initiative, and free trade agreements and other architecture that could help build an internationalism in the region, a sense of a regional identity and habits of dialogue and of cooperation. And so that was very much the philosophy of those post-Cold War days. And so as a young Australian diplomat, I was very much influenced by that thinking. And so our engagement in those days with China as a rapidly growing economy was a very positive one for Australia. Australia had a huge benefit from its trade with China. It grew over time to become what it is today, a $300 billion bilateral trade, a huge trade surplus in Australia's favour. And many Australians are very prosperous as a result of Australia's interactions, its economic integration, in a sense, with the rise of China, just as previously Australia had benefited enormously from the rise of Japan in the post-war era and had also economically integrated with Japan. So for Australians, the story of China was a pretty positive one. And also there's been a very positive experience of Chinese migration to Australia. So there are 1.5 million Australians of Chinese ancestry and very successful experience that has been. So it wasn't until 2017 really when everything changed, and I was sitting in Beijing as a diplomat, but not working for my home country at that time. I was working for the Pacific Island countries of Oceania for the regional organization called the Pacific Islands Forum. And so I observed sitting there in Beijing how the world just changed with the election of Donald Trump, with the rise of geopolitical competition between the United States and China, and the impact that that had on countries that were aligned with the United States, like Australia. So Australia was kind of stuck in the middle of that. Australia was very deeply economically integrated with China, but of course, as an ally of the United States and a very loyal ally of the United States. Australia has turned up to every battle that the United States has been in since 1917. So Australia considers itself to be deeply strategically integrated with the United States. And so in 2017, when Donald Trump declared China a strategic competitor, and when the narrative in the West as a whole turned into this China threat narrative, that China was a threat to the West, this had a huge impact in Australia as it did elsewhere. And so my thinking here, my approach to this was to try and step back from that, to try and not take a side or make assumptions that something suddenly was a threat that a year earlier had been seen as a massive opportunity. I was trying to dig deeper into why might that have happened. And so, of course, I studied, like many others have studied, the geopolitical competition that was emerging there between the US and China, but also tried to understand how does China see things. And I think China has benefited, like Australia, China has benefited enormously from rising in that post-Cold War era, an era of trade liberalisation, an era when the countries that it was trading with were lowering barriers, unlike what we're seeing in the United States today. It was a period when China was able to integrate itself into global supply chains, exactly as Japan had done, as South Korea had done, and the other great Asian economic development success stories. China was able to do that on an even larger scale. Now, we know that, of course, China is a different political system. It is not anything like a Western liberal democracy, but some of those East Asian countries don't necessarily resemble Western liberal democracies either. So I wanted to dig into, well, how do the Chinese see the development story? How do they see their integration? And so I did lots of interviews and lots of research trying to understand that. I think it's difficult to make broad brush generalizations about China because it is relatively opaque to outside observers. But nevertheless, I think a broad generalization would be that China has seen the benefits of globalization and it has benefited from globalization. And so it's actually relatively committed, arguably more committed than the United States, for example, which is clearly under Donald Trump stepping away from globalization and from the rules-based order that underpins that. China, on the other hand, sees many benefits. Now, that doesn't mean that China doesn't want to change the world order. Of course it does. China does not welcome a Western-dominated world order, a world order in which it has a secondary place. China clearly wants to be at the top table. It wants to be a leader. It argues that it seeks a multipolar world. And so I've tried in my research to understand, how do Chinese people see that? How do people across Asia see this question of multipolarity, which frightens people in the West? The European experience of multipolarity was disastrous, but the Asian experience of multipolarity historically has not been nearly as dangerous. Asians often look at multipolarity as offering the potential for mutual coexistence, for a diversity of powers to coexist. Of course, there's a lot of risk in that situation. If we're moving into a situation of multipolarity, it raises a large number of risks. And so my conclusion is we need serious risk management instead of the overblown geopolitical threat scenarios that China saying the West is the threat, the West saying China is the threat. I think actually what we need is some serious risk management.
I completely agree with the need for structures that help us to manage risk. The problem that I see is that there are a couple of forces on all sides that rather go to I mean, they usually say like competition, but what they mean is just go heads on, right? And actually use the tools of power available. And I see approaches of this in both. I mean, clearly in the United States, but also in China. If you look at a bit how China approaches smaller neighbors, especially the one that still baffles me and that I don't understand. And I seriously, all Chinese friends, somebody needs to explain to me the approach to the Philippines, because the Philippines would be so easy to woo over. It would be so easy to have them as a friend, but I just don't get that one. But you also looked at the connections with these smaller states. How do you explain this? From both sides, the US on the one hand and China on the other, everybody seems to expect a clash in the Pacific. I mean, if you look at the military configuration, okay, that's one thing, but it extends into the economic realm, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a question of firstly the principles that underpin the approach, but then of course a healthy understanding, a healthy skepticism about how big powers operate, because of course big powers can have a set of principles, but they can also uh, implement them in an inconsistent manner, what we generally call in international relations the double standards problem. And so there's no doubt that there are a number of issues to think about here. But it is important, I think, to look at the first principles, because particularly in a party state like China, when China sets out its plan, when it sets out its agenda, this is something that actually is relatively transparent. We can observe the processes of China announcing what its intentions are, what its principles are. We may agree or disagree with those, but it's a process that's relatively easy to observe because those principles are, of course, applied through the party state from the top all the way down to the bottom. Everyone must follow a principle when it is a guideline, when it's actually set out as the course direction that the country is taking. And so China in the modern era, there was some inconsistency in the early era of the People's Republic of China, but in the modern era, since the 1980s, China has demonstrated a deep commitment to these Bandung principles, the non-alignment principles of non-intervention in other countries, peaceful coexistence and mutual respect between countries. That's core to the principles that China lays out. Now, that doesn't mean that we should accept that on face value, but it does mean that's their general approach. And so when they're voting in the United Nations, the China consistently just doesn't take a position when it's about the internal affairs of another country, which is a very interesting difference from our usual Western perspective, where, of course, in the Western tradition, there are hundreds of years of experience of Western countries seeking to intervene and seeking to influence other countries. So there's an assumption in the West that China's going to do the same thing, that it's going to want to influence and intervene in other countries. Within China, there's an assumption that it won't, that it will be different. Now, I think the reality is probably somewhere in the middle, because it depends what we mean by influence and power and influence. As you say, in the economic realm, of course, there's a very healthy competition going on here, and there's no doubt that China, as it continues to grow, it's already on most measures the largest economy in the world, and certainly in terms of trade and its international impact. So we can expect that China will look after its interests, and some from time to time that may contradict the interests of other parties. So that's one area where I'd want to look very carefully. But the other question is, I think, yeah, there'll also be questions around China's core interests, the areas that China claims are core to its own national security. And it will take, I think we can expect as a big power that it will take a tougher approach to those questions. But at the same time, if I try and take a balanced approach here, at the same time, the evidence so far has been that China wants to engage through the multilateral system. And that's good news, because if you want to build the institutions and the traditions and habits of finding cooperation, then the United Nations system, the whole multilateral system in finance, in every realm, that's the place, that's a good place to start. If you've got a rising power saying it wants to work within that system, even if at times it's not going to be consistent, like with the international law of the sea. But I think that's a good starting point. And it's a tragedy, really, at this point in world history, as China is rising, that we've got the United States stepping away from that international system of rules, that the United States was a key architect, was a key designer of the post-war system and all of those institutions that, they've got their weaknesses, they're not perfect, but they're all we have in terms of multilateral cooperation.
Yeah, but one of the takeaways for me is that the United States is happy building international structures as long as it's the top dog that actually gets to deploy those international structures. And a wonderful example is the WTO, right? The World Trade Organization. And just it's for China. I think it's really important to remember that the economic model in China was only changed under Deng Xiaoping in the 1970s, right? 20 years later, they decide, okay, now let's start to integrate. And they joined the WTO in 1990, 1991,
Mm.
something like
Yeah.
that, right?
Uh,
And the WTO,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
which one was it?
Yeah, it was a decade later than that they joined the
What was
WTO.
sorry, yeah, 2001. So 30 years of economic restructuring inside the country, then joining the WTO. And the WTO is supposed to be this arbiter of trade, right? Without having supranational powers, but you create a body that then is able to adjudicate trade disputes among companies, but also among states and companies and states and states. It's an arbitration body, right? And now the United States checkmates that body by basically refusing to send judges, appoint judges to the appellate body. Therefore, the whole structure is basically gone. You cannot adjudicate stuff anymore. China is very bitter about this and wants to integrate and actually have such an adjudicating body, but it's still the United States and the West that keeps saying, oh, China is an economic threat to the world order. How do you make sense of this? Of this signaling, other than okay, it's we're in an era where now the US is trying to use great power politics in order to hammer down a nail that's sticking out.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that there is great power politics going on here. I think that's one of my conclusions, that I think we can kind of expect that it's only natural that the United States is going to feel threatened by a new peer competitor. I mean, in a sense, China, on many dimensions, China is a greater peer competitor to the US than the Soviet Union ever was, because China is deeply economically integrated with the world. I mean, more of the world's member countries are deeply integrated with China than are with the US. China is the largest trading partner for most countries in the world today. And as China continues to economically integrate with the world, that just alone, just in terms of economic competition, makes China a significant competitor for the US. But of course, in strategic terms, what that also means, as the strategic thinkers in the US know, that economic power leads to strategic power, that as China gets richer and as it has more of an economic footprint in the world, of course, it does have the potential, as the US has done, to use its economic muscle for strategic purposes if it so wishes. And so that's going to be the area, that's one of the key areas of risk, of course, is to observe how will China act in the future. But I think it's also important to have a look at how has China acted to date, and that's that's a very interesting question to ask. I noted in my book that it's almost as if the major Western countries of North America and Europe only really noticed the rise of China in the 21st century. It was as if that it took the global financial crisis, it took the Beijing Olympics, it took a few big events before people in the West generally noticed China. But that's why I introduced my comments as an Australian, because we had been noticing the rise of China since the 1980s. Australia had been deeply economically integrated, just as Japan had been, and Singapore and other countries in the region had become deeply economically integrated with China long before it appears the US and Europe even really noticed what was going on. So there actually is a track record. There's a track record of decades and decades of trade and investment, international education. In the case of Australia, hundreds of thousands of Chinese students coming through universities. So there actually is a good, solid track record to study and to observe and to see, have there been any major problems? Have there been things that have, has there been economic influence used? And all of the kinds of concerns that people have, I think we can measure and research. And so my point would be that to date, we actually don't have so much evidence of the great threat analysis, the great threat discourse, which is not to say that China will not use its power now or in the future. It's simply to say that I think we need to be very cautious about the evidence, and we need to continue to observe the evidence, to call out any great power when it uses double standards, just as, there are many voices around the world today calling out the United States for what it's doing with this tariff war against the world, it seems. Well, equally, if China is using, if and where China is using its economic coercion, as it did indeed against Australia a few years ago, as it has against South Korea and a few other places, those instances need to also be called out, because you will get double standards when you are talking about a great power. But overall, I think it's more important to be evidence-led. And overall, as I say, when we come back to these institutions, having rules, having dispute settlement mechanisms, these are fundamental. Even in the Cold War, at the depths of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union were still able to cooperate in key areas of safety and peace and international cooperation. For example, aviation, nuclear safety, a whole range of areas where there were institutions that operated safely and efficiently. There was a level of trust, even though the trust needed to be verified, as Ronald Reagan famously said. But the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, great example where the Soviet Union and the US had the potential to destroy each other, but they built cooperatively together a set of rules and institutions, inspection protocols and others to reduce the distrust down to a very low level. And the IAEA, of course, wasn't 100% perfect. There were a few rule breakers over the Cold War period, but overall, it set the tone of resolving big problems and resolving disputes. And it seems to me that that's the kind of leadership and that's the kind of risk management we're going to need in the decade or two or three ahead, because at the moment there doesn't seem to be any appetite for sitting down and cooperating with China, and seems to be just a fear that any cooperation is not trustworthy, that we're not going to be able to build trust with a system that is very different. I would observe that in Asia as a whole, we are living with a multitude of different political systems, different philosophies, different cultures. And if we can't figure out how to all get along and how to build norms and rules to live by in the international community, well, then we are headed for the kinds of chaos that the world hasn't seen now for a century.
Yeah, I just wonder how to build that, because one of the problems is, of course, these the deep entrenchedness of the double standards. And the double standards to me are most glaring on the Western side. I mean, not to say that the other great powers and so on are flawless, but we are going through a moment in time where the Western world is crying genocide over Xinjiang and Uyghurs, while saying what Palestine, it's normal that every day 70 to 100 people just die because bombs just explode. That's normal. And anyone who pretends that this is a genocide is actually anti-Semitic, right? That's the thing we're going through. How do we? These are such glaring hypocrisies that I wonder that they really also don't they undermine the fundamental, as you said, trust needed to say like, okay, if we set out a standard together, you and I, then we can trust that both of us will have a similar understanding of them. The history of the US has been again try to build institutions in order to use the institutions for power projection. That's obviously not what China or Russia or others want. They want institutions in order to manage, not to dominate. Or I hope that's what they want, the globe. Or maybe that's one of the Western fears that if China builds an international institution, it will do exactly the same what the West did, which is try to use it as a power projection tool. How do you
I
see,
think
how can we resolve this?
Well, I think that is the fear, and I think it's a deeply held fear. And I think if we look at the Western tradition over hundreds of years, we can see why we in the West have built a set of values, and we believe that we have perfected those over hundreds of years. We believe we have less double standards than we used to. We genuinely believe that, I think, in Western societies, and compared with the way European powers colonized the world. The West is a much better actor now than probably it was a few hundred years ago. But it is deeply entrenched in our way of thinking in the West that there is a binary, that there is a good guy and there's a bad guy. And so if we've come to the conclusion that we're the good guys, and for many reasons, there is lots of evidence for that, lots of reasons why people in the West believe we have the best standard of living and the best quality of life and the best institutions. So that kind of hubris, if you like, which can look very aggressive to people in the rest of the world. I think we can understand why we feel that way in the West. And so the challenge for us is to now come to grips with a changing world order that, okay, the West has dominated the world and we did make lots of mistakes, but we think we've learned some of those. There's more to learn. There's a lot more to learn about the complexity of civilizations and of philosophies and of the different ways that countries in Asia see the world. And China is the big one. China is the obvious one that we have to come to grips with, but India is not far behind. And I think Indonesia will be not far behind, and Vietnam. These are all hugely different civilizations from Western civilization. And thanks to development, thanks to globalization, thanks to the successful development we've seen, especially in East Asia, but we're seeing it now spread to the rest of the developing world. This multipolar world is coming. These countries are rising, their living standards are rising, hundreds of millions, actually billions of people are living better today in those countries than ever before. So this is a good thing. This is a very good thing that the world is not as unequal as it was in the past. So how do we in the Western countries that always benefited from the previous system, how do we grapple with how do we deal with a new, more diverse world, with a more multipolar world? There's no easy answer to this, but this is why I'm suggesting that we do need to rethink the narratives around international relations, because they've all been written in Washington, in London and Brussels and other places, and Canberra, places in the West where we've had our particular view of the world. I think we've now got to look at the world as a place with a diversity of worldviews. And we have to, those of us who want to have a peaceful world, we're going to need to resuscitate internationalism, but it may not be the liberal internationalism that those of us who come from liberal democracies wish to see in the whole world. It's just not realistic. We need a more sustainable internationalism that can cope with difference, that can actually acknowledge that, okay, you have a different political system, you even might have a slightly different economic system than ours, but we are going to actually deal with you. We're going to find a way to manage those risks. We're going to develop the rules and institutions to build trust. And I think if we don't do that, we are headed to disaster. So it seems to me we need these voices. They're not very loud voices at the moment because I think we're deep in the middle of a real decline in trust, and it could take some time for us to work our way out of that. It will certainly take political leadership. And my final comment on this whole problem is that in our Western liberal democracies, we're very proud of our democratic traditions. But what seems to have happened in the social media era, with the decline of the business model for traditional media, with the more professional political class of people who are not necessarily leaders who've come out of leadership experience in the real world, but we have politicians who've spent their whole lives just working in politics. We are now in a world, even in these liberal democracies with very proud traditions, like my own home country of Australia, but we're now in a political bubble of lots of political speak where politicians feel a need to talk in these very dramatic terms, a need to talk about threats and we're the good guys and they're the bad guys, perhaps even more than in the past. Perhaps even this is even a bigger problem to have a conversation about complexity where when our politicians are jumping to a 24-hour media cycle and when there's declining trust in the liberal democracies, in our own political class. So we don't even trust them. So it's almost like everything is going wrong at the same time. It's like a perfect storm. So to try and solve these problems, it's not easy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I just wonder if it has more to do with the turmoil at home than actually the international politics outside. Because on the one hand, we're seeing instability in Western countries, deep instability. We are also seeing democratic backsliding in Western countries while being proud of having these democratic traditions. And maybe just let me ask you this. Do you think there's this generation that's currently holding power, people between their 40s and 70s somewhere, is there a level of disillusionment with their own expectations? Because the longest time, especially after the Cold War, after 1991, the whole expectation was, well, now everybody is gonna become a liberal democracy. That's the Fukuyama, right? And if you want to become rich, you have to become a liberal democracy. It will go hand in hand. It's just a quick matter of time. China is not there yet. Russia is not there yet. The some countries are not there yet, but they will get there. And now suddenly we realize China is really rich. Russia is doing really well. They're not liberal democracies. What the hell? Is that this feeling of disillusionment? Is that something that fuels this absence of an approach other than confrontation?
I think it's an important part of the problem. I think that part of the reason why there's such a consensus in the West around the China threat is that you've got on perhaps it's old-fashioned to talk about right and left, but on what we might have traditionally called the right of politics, you've got this geopolitical muscling up that we want to compete. But on the left, or the liberal left, as the Americans would call it, you have got exactly what you've just described. You have this liberal disillusionment where I think there was while the hard-nosed realists perhaps never expected the world to be perfect and just believe in rugged competition. But the liberals, and of course the people who used to call themselves liberal internationalists, I think were very much influenced in the post-Cold War era in both the US and in Europe by these ideas that history had ended. I think in the European case, Europeans were very self-absorbed in their own experiment with building a political union, which was really thrust upon them, I believe, by the end of the Cold War. I think there was a sudden scurrying around to figure out how does Western Europe absorb Central and Eastern Europe? How do we build something that's safe and secure for liberal democracy? And so the EU was this big project to imagine a big liberal space. Well, my experience of having spent a lot of time in Central and Eastern Europe is that I don't think these are societies that are easily going to transform into Western style liberal democracies anytime quickly at all. But however, there are many people who do want to take that journey, and I wish them well. But I think it's hard enough in Europe. And of course, in the United States, we've also seen the decline in the consensus around liberal values as well. So yes, there is a crisis in the West, but I would comment that again, as an Australian, I don't recall working as an Australian diplomat ever anyone in the Australian system of government or business or academics. I don't remember anyone claiming China was going to become a liberal democracy. I mean, this seems to me to have been a very naive observation, perhaps by people who'd never been to China. And perhaps people who've never been to Asia as a whole. Perhaps they're writing their books about foreign policy imagining the whole world can be like Europe and America. But actually, for those of us living here in the Asia Pacific, I just think we've always been aware, and we will always be aware, that it's a much more complicated place. It's a much more diverse place. And so these grand theories that the West can make the world in its image. Well, we here in Australia don't imagine we can make Indonesia become like Australia. We just have never thought that. It's never occurred to us. We can't even make Fiji like Australia. So why it just doesn't occur to us to have this missionary zeal. Of course, I think you're right that it's part of the Western problem, perhaps, is that we feel disillusioned as a whole, that the rest of the world isn't embracing our model. We ought to be, I'm pretty proud of our model, actually. I think we should be digging down on it, making it work in our own countries. Perhaps that's the place to start.
In your book, you hint at well, not hint at, you were saying like we need a new internationalism. The old model of internationalism, I suppose, like this kind of 1990s style, early 2000s style globalization. And you know how globalization was like a huge half a book in every international relations book. There was like the half of it was dedicated to globalization, and that half has now faded away. people people are conveniently forgetting that this is what we talked about. But what is the new kind of internationalism? Because that kind of globalization was basically remaking the world in the West, right? And a westernization, basically. But now, what's this new version that you're thinking about that has to come if we want to remain peaceful?
I don't think I agree that globalization was westernization. I think globalization was Asianization. I think the globalization moment, when historians look back at what happened in the late 20th century, what happened was Asia. What happened was that there was this explosion of development in East Asia in particular. And how that happened was that those economies had access to world markets. They had access to the giant US market, and Europe, after the end of the Cold War, embraced free trade, which was quite a shock because Europe had been a protectionist player in the world economy until that time. So Europe opened up as well to Asian exporters. And so the growth of Asia, the global value chains that evolved in the era of globalization were Asia-based value chains. And so while those in the West describe it the way you have, it's a common narrative that this was a westernization. I characterize it the other way around. I actually think it was Asia that drove the globalization. I think I mentioned before APEC. I think the structures of Asian regionalism that were developed that included not just the traditional Asian countries, if you like, but also countries like Australia and New Zealand, and also the United States was a key supporter of this free trade logic of the Asian development until the arrival of Donald Trump, or at least that rough period, because we could also put Hillary Clinton into that box of someone who was, at the end of the day, not going to support any further Asianization of the globalization process. But I do think that this has been the shock to the world. This is why Europeans, I was just teaching at a French university and I asked my students who supports free trade. Not one hand went up. So Europeans have turned against free trade again. They've gone back to their traditional setting, and the United States has clearly turned against free trade. The countries of Asia need free trade. The countries of Asia, and that includes my home country of Australia, absolutely require free trade for our prosperity. And so therefore, what we're seeing now, the share of the world's GDP it's almost approaching 50% now, is going to be driven by countries that are dedicated to expanding globalization. So I don't think globalization is going anywhere, but Europe and North America, or Europe and the United States, may well be choosing not to be key players in that process of globalization, which raises, I think, big questions about how competitive they will be, because I expect the globalization process driven by China and India and the other major Asian economies is not going to stop. The impact of the tariffs today that Donald Trump's just announced are going to have some effect on China, but they're not actually going to stop the processes that are going on of the massive industrial modernization that's going on in China is not going to be slowed. It's just going to be diverted to other markets. Same will be the same for all of us. If we're locked out of US or European markets, we will simply look to the new emerging markets of Asia, of Africa, of South America, and you'll see globalization, I think, continue, but it will not look very Western. It will look multilateral and global.
There's a very strong argument that John Pang made on this channel that, one of the reasons why ASEAN is currently so optimistic is that ASEAN, the way it works, has been working as a multipolar system for the last 50 years. And while it was looked down and belittled in the 90s and the early 2000s, it's now kind of coming up on top, saying like, look, this model actually works if compared to the European Union's integration drive. Do you also think that there's like that ASEAN and the Southeast Asian experience can give us good clues of how to build institutions that, even though they're not centralized, still work in terms of keeping stuff stable?
I do. And, I read, when I was doing my PhD, I read some literature about the regionalization issues. And so much of the narrative in the English language literature imagines that the European Union is the perfect example of regionalism and that ASEAN is a failed example because it hasn't centralized, because it hasn't deepened its integration to become a political union like Europe. But yeah, again, I tend to look at this a bit skeptically. I think the European Union, as successful as it has been on many levels, although I do fear that it's in a bit of a crisis at the moment. But Europe is a special case, I think, and I think Europe has had a special problem to solve. And firstly, of course, the aftermath of the Second World War, but then the aftermath of the end of the Cold War. Europe has had a particular set of problems. ASEAN, on the other hand, has actually been quite fit for purpose for a region of the world where each of those countries, as different as they are, ranging from Vietnam to Singapore, from some of the poorest countries, Myanmar, Cambodia, to some of the richest countries with totally different political systems and totally different economies, but able to build cooperation, to still be quite central to not just the economic trade links and the economic architecture of the region, but also to the security architecture. ASEAN centrality is still very important because of the principles. Again, coming back to those Bandung principles. I mean, ASEAN stands for all of those principles of non-alignment, even though some of its members, like the Philippines, may well be aligned with the US. And so I think, yes, I think ASEAN's an interesting model to look at for the whole of Asia, for how can very different countries find models of cooperation, of sharing standards and rules and finding ways to resolve disputes. Absolutely. And the other thing to remember is ASEAN is now China's number one trading partner. It's where China is deeply integrated, but of course ASEAN is open to the world. It's also very much economically integrated with the West as well. And so that seems to me to be the future. And I would argue for my own home country, that's the future as well, to be economically and culturally and in every other way integrated with the world. And that includes China, but it of course includes the West as well. Finding a way that you can do both, whereas the very simplistic narrative has been, no, you've got to choose one or the other. Well, I don't think Indonesia is going to choose one or the other. I don't think Singapore, tiny Singapore, is going to choose just to bandwagon with one big power. It will it will want to hedge and balance, and that may well be the future for many more countries than we might have ever imagined, thanks perhaps to the big changes occurring in Washington in recent times.
And thank you very much for that, because this also brings me to something that I want to ask you about an analysis like you made like 30 minutes ago, which is also the need to review or revise how we teach and study international relations. And what you just hinted at is one of the points of my own study and also the very existence of this channel. It's that modern international relations has basically written out neutrality out of the textbooks of international relations. We don't even use the word. Modern American-centered international relations has replaced the word neutrality with concepts like hedging, bandwagoning, balancing, right? But it always takes away the option of being a third thing on your own, right? In your own right. It always goes back to this dichotomy and this necessity to choose. Do I believe that the multipolar world will lend itself to the reimagination of third party politics? Do you see it that way too? And do you think that ASEAN is already and Asia is already trying to implement that in one way or another?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and it could well be that for some countries, in particular countries that might be seen as buffer countries between big powers, it may well be that the neutrality model, which seems to have worked quite well for Switzerland, if you could get the agreement of all of the great powers to respect neutrality, and if you actually were confident that you had a level of ability to defend yourself as well, it could well be in the future. I think you could be right that neutrality could come back into play, at least into debates and into discussions. And it's very interesting that here in Australia, where there has been a long history of the whole of Australia's history, it has been dependent on what we tend to call a great and powerful friend. So Australia was entirely dependent on the British Empire, of course, in its formation century as British colonies. But then after the fall of the British in Singapore in 1942, Australia switched its allegiance to the United States and has been entirely in the United States camp ever since. And there's never been a voice at all for this discussion about neutrality. It's just not politically realistic, because to win elections in Australia, of course, you have to support the US alliance. And so both major parties have always been advocates for alignment. But whether there'll be space for some third voices, even in a country like this in the future, you never know. I think the world is so unpredictable at the moment. And if it was the case that the US was stepping back from its implied security guarantees, that might well open up those sort of discussions, even for countries that are aligned. But I think that's some way off into the future. I don't think that's very realistic at present. I think while we're in this, what feels like a crisis of the changing world order, it's much more likely people will dig into what they're comfortable with and where they feel familiar. Whether that's the case for crisis areas, though, neutrality might well be a useful solution to offer in a crisis region, for example, but it hasn't been very much on the radar. So yeah, look, I think it's a very interesting discussion, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if we hear more about neutrality, or at least non-alignment. Even in the Cold War, we didn't hear much about the non-aligned movement. They were kind of sidelined, but actually they accounted for a large part of the world. The new world order we're moving into, non-aligned countries are going to be big players. They're going to be central to the world economy and to the international discussions. We're not going to be able to talk about international relations without talking about non-aligned countries in future, in my view. And the giant Indonesia is a great example of this. No one ever thinks about it. No one talks about Indonesia, but it's the fourth biggest country in the world. It's growing rapidly. It's the biggest Muslim country in the world. It has quite a unique culture and civilization. It's not Western, and that it's right next to Australia, right next to a continent that is Western. So we might need to talk a whole lot more about that particular non-aligned country in the future, and the peaceful integration of a growing power of Indonesia into its region, the embedding of peace for Indonesia, which certainly looks like the likely scenario. There aren't any great fears that Indonesia is going to become aggressive in the future. So the peaceful embedding of a more powerful Indonesia in the region could be one of the great trends of the world to come. But the international relations literature kind of ignores that country, perhaps to its peril.
If you had an advice for students of international relations, what bachelor thesis or master thesis to focus on, what would you tell them? What's currently, or what is a topic that they could research right now that in 10 years people will still say, "Oh, wow, you were very early looking at that." What's the next big thing?
Well, when I was doing my PhD dissertation, I wanted to look at the Belt and Road Initiative because I thought that was the kind of big global initiative out of China that warranted a lot more study. And when I made that decision to do it, there wasn't much around, there wasn't much literature at all. And I'm very pleased to say that over the subsequent years, I mean, doing a PhD takes many years. And so over that time, of course, many other people had the same bright idea that I had. And so there's now lots of literature about the Belt and Road. And so you can actually dig deep and you can now read all about case studies and examples of the Belt and Road Initiative around the world. And so I think we need people to be looking at what are those trends, what are those new initiatives that are coming out of the rising powers, China, India, and other countries as well. What are the regional initiatives that are developing, and to deeply understand them and not to just look at them through a Western lens of Western values and some assumption that they're all a threat, but rather to try and understand from the evidence what's really going on, what are their intentions, and also, of course, to study where are the double standards and where might the problems lie. But I'm particularly keen on bringing a risk analysis approach to things that rather like diplomats do, in my experience, when I was a diplomat, or rather like international businesses do. When you go into a new country, you don't just accept some generic threat analysis or some very simplistic approach that everything's going to happen according to some one generalization. What you do when you're in a foreign country as a business person or as a diplomat is you deeply embed yourself. You get to meet as many people as you can. You collect as much information. You study the evidence, and you try and understand the complexity of what's going on. And so the purpose of being a diplomat or working for an international company in country is that you can advise your headquarters that, hey, you guys, it's more complicated than what you're reading in the newspapers. Here are the trends. Here are the likely scenarios. And I think if we used a bit of that political risk type analysis in international relations, a bit more than just these grand theories and grand assumptions, if we actually looked at the detail of what's going on, the evidence, we'd find that it's a lot more complicated, and we might find some clues to solutions. Whereas just accepting the grand theory that, oh, we're the good guys and they're the bad guys, that doesn't seem to be leading us to a solution.
I think those are very wise words. People dig deeper and accept and understand complexity. I think David, I would like everybody to, sorry, I would like to thank you, and I would like to ask everybody go and check out David's book. The title, as you said in the beginning, is A New Era of Risk: Why We Need a New Sustainable Internationalism to Manage the Rise of China. Exactly this one. And if people want to follow you somewhere else, do you have a place where you publish occasionally or regularly?
Yes, look, absolutely. You can find me. I'm on X and Facebook and LinkedIn. And so if you look for David Morris, or if you look for One Earth Village, which is the number one, oneearthvillage.net, oneearthvillage.com as well, I think will work, or oneearthvillage.org. You will find there my non-profit organization, but also I have all my publications on one of those pages there as well.
Wonderful. David Morris, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much.